I've known Omar for many years. He's one of the leading experts looking at the impact of conflict on the environment and on health. And today he's going to talk about some very exciting research having to do with antimicrobial resistance, as well as just sort of the broader question of what does war do to the environment, disease? Does war create ecologies and sort of new biologies that actually shape the way we think about what it means to be healthy, what it means to be sick, what it means to heal? So I know we have a few students here, like Abdullah from medical sciences. Anybody else? Okay, so you're the medical lab. Medical labs is great. I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts on the topic once we get to the discussion. So without further ado, Omar Dawati.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mac, for the introduction, and thanks to the university and the administration here, and thanks to Zainab, who's been really so amazing in organizing, coordinating my visit. So I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in Suleymaniye, so I'm really enchanted by the place so far, and would really look forward to come back at some point and maybe interact more with the students and interact more with the university. So my talk today is titled War Biology in the Middle East. And what I'll do today is I'll tell you a story about my research, and I'm hoping through the story to kind of explain to you what is medical anthropology and what do we do as medical anthropologists, but also tell you a story about how, as Matt said, how war changes and transfigures forms of life, which is something maybe is, it's intuitive. Yeah, war changes everything, but I'm going to be looking at a kind of different scales of that transformation. How we going to be seeing it at the level of larger places, the region. We're going to be looking at it at the level of bodies, and then we're going to be looking at it at the kind of a very more microscopic level, at the level of bacteria and inside what happens inside the cells. So we're going to be moving across these different scales of transformations that are happening, and of course, for me, it's exciting to talk here in the region rather than a lot of my work. I give these talks mostly in the West, in the US, in the UK, or in Europe. So it's very, very, for me, it's very special to kind of give it in a place where people have actually kind of experienced a lot of that history of conflict. So without further ado, let me kind of take you through this journey about war biology. So one thing I want to start with is to define what medical anthropology is. As Mike said, I'm a physician. So I trained as a medical doctor in Iraq in the 1990s. So I worked. I entered medical school immediately after the first Gulf War, 1991, and I kind of studied medicine and worked as a doctor in Baghdad until 1998, and then after that I left. I studied public health in Beirut at the American University of Beirut, and then I kind of did my PhD in medical anthropology at Harvard University. And since then, I've been working I wear many hats. I wear a hat of a physician who is trying to solve medical problems. I wear a hat of a social scientist who is writing about social interaction and the relationship between medicine and society. I also wear a hat of the public health person who is interested in thinking about policy, thinking about how do we advise different actors working in the field to change the ways these problems are addressed. So I'm hoping kind of to go through a lot of these issues with you today. So the discipline of medical anthropology, like this is a quote from the Society for Medical Anthropology. If you Google medical anthropology, the first thing maybe will come out is the Society for Medical Anthropology. Defines medical anthropology or kind of explain that medical anthropology draws upon many different theoretical approaches. It attends to popular health culture, bioscientific epidemiology, and social construction of knowledge, politics of science, scientific discovery, and hypothesis testing. So medical anthropologists examine how health of individuals, larger social formations, and the environment are affected by interrelationships between humans and other species, cultural norms, social institutions, micro and macro politics, and forces of globalization, etc., etc. So these are just general ideas. One of the themes that we study in medical anthropology are comparative healthcare systems. So we look at how different healthcare systems, let's say in Iraq and the UK or in China, how they differ, how they're practiced. So this is one idea. Historically, it used to be called ethnomedicine. Cross-cultural experiences and narratives of illness and health and the body. So how do people speak about illness? How do they explain their illness? What kind of meaning they attribute to the illness? So people could think it's a kind of a punishment from God, or people ask, why me, when they get sick. So these are meanings that people attribute to things about their body, about health and illness. We also not necessarily look at cultural aspect of people, but we look at the culture of medicine itself and the bioscience and biotechnology. How biotechnology shapes the meaning of certain kind of concepts. So this is you can be study as an anthropologist. You can be looking at a laboratory and trying to understand how people in this lab attribute meaning to the discoveries and the work that they are doing. We also study the political economy of health and disease and science and scientific interventions. What kind of politics shape health? What kind of economic processes are there to what kind of economic processes there to kind of produce certain kind of differentiations in health. So this is something we'll kind of address. We address something called local biologies, and this is a very important concept in medical anthropology, which is the interactions between biological, environmental, social factors influencing health and illness at both individual and a community level. And the idea, when we think about biology, we think of biology as a universal thing. We all share the same biology. But actually, biology is shaped by place, by time, and this is something that I will address today in this idea of war biology. One other thing, we address social and structural determinants of health and disease. A lot of those work through social epidemiology. Why are people with lower socioeconomic status have more disease? Why there are certain inequalities that affect access to healthcare? So these are also we call them determinants of health that are very important in the study of anthropology. We also, as anthropologists or medical anthropologists, we look at, we kind of set hypotheses and try to test them and try to figure out if they're true or not. And I'll try to maybe cover many of these themes in this presentation. So one of the things that I've been really researching over the past decade, for the past 10 years, is this mystery of this one bacteria that has kind of puzzled a lot of scientists, especially the scientists in the United States, and also people who are working on conflict and medicine and conflict in the region. So I'm going to show you a kind of a 5-6 minute video that came out in the beginning of the Iraq War when the US invaded Iraq. And that video is going to kind of summarize a lot of the history of this bacteria. And then from there, I'm going to take on to guide you through some of the research and some of the work that I've been doing around the questions surrounding this mystery. So let's do this.
In that state, I had it.
More great. With obviously the way. The merchant. For crap. Each of it sold it a pink and wet. He sat in his pocket. He said the pot of it. What? We don't not fight. Had to fight. But it was a handful of the field. It corresponded John Tory. What would it be? It did. Out. Anyway, the killer shoots a rat, but it doesn't carry a gun. It is attacking injured soldiers with the kind of and clinical care, surviving in large numbers in the ever before. I was a doctor in Atlanta with your medicine. I can take a person frigates. The survivor we get wounded soldier. It took a mind of its way. But it's one with the downside. That downside comes in the form of a tiny microbe with a powerful punch. Here is the culprit. It's a bacterium called Leponian, referred to the drag as Procletica. It's named for microbiologist Paul Fowler, who researched it back in 1968. But even he couldn't predict what this tiny seal cell organism would one day become. When host bacteria and lives in colonies, it's constantly reproducing simply by dividing and dividing again. A single bacterium can give rise to 5 billion trillion only a day. This body used to be relatively harmless. Yet somehow it's found a way to transform itself into a drug-resistant killer. One of its many victims was AC correspondent Bob Luther. On the January 29, 2006, while he met with the U.S. Army detective and he didn't bag it, his vehicle was hit by a roadside call.
Yes, the breaking news from the court of Heidelberg World News today with it.
To keep him alive, doctors had him heart stole and did the medical coma. Miraculously, Bob was stabilized and evacuated to Bethesda Naval Hospital of Queen Mary. His wife, Lee, was on his side. What was one of Bob?
I tried many different subjects. That reported to the is about it and sex's sake. That's
Obama actually that's on his body, and he was back at death's door.
it seemed impossible that Temple could be in a bar hit by a bomb like this and had be actually found by a bacteria.
Lots of the earth is just one of the men soaked in screens, picking up his dead life in hospitals belonging to evacuating Jane at and bringing it back home to America, where it's affecting the people never see the battlefield. And that's just believe and hang around in places where it off, like club cases and all, where the kids survive for weeks. So why not change them an antibiotic and so fight it? After all, having antibiotics and not bullets saving filtered lives since World War II. We saved a lot of lives and so on their drug. But something has changed. Now bugs are fighting back. Microbiologist Mike Smith demonstrates how resistant this bug has become. You take down mankind and you put it out late 8 a.m. He places colony containing tons of bacteria in several petri dishes and converts it in the venom. An antibiotic so strong it's making gorilla cell. After 12 hours, all the bacteria is dead, but they're not. Fortunately, this is an active team where the body is divided. Knowing that company says you're able to colony is normal cell and some of the entire population now would be afternoon on.
this is a strain of slip and predators to characterize bearers in the bottom of that. Its DNA will be sequenced one letter at a time. The result will be able to Kamani has large sections of genes that don't belong. Or indeed, they're giving resistance to antibiotics. There's resistance to 45 drug resistance genes is happening at one spot. This should be a mark because that's what this did. How is this possible? And there's one way we get our genes, and that's from our parents. It's called vertical gene transfer. But it turns out bacteria can also get genes in a process called horizontal gene transfer. One way that happens is when the two bacteria get together for a little friendly conjugation. The microbial form of snuggly. They form connection and squirt DNA into each other. Jump it out, but the one end is beginning a little too friendly. Could that be what's making it so nasty? To find out, Rick Smoot is absent.
Okay.
Just exit out.
Hmm? I don't think so. It was kind of... It worked just before.
Clip that.
Whoops.
And all the
You let it work.
It worked actually in the test.
They work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. Story of a bacteria emerging in this kind of war context, being carried back with the American soldiers, or at least the first being reported with the U.S. invasion actually begins to be reported in March 2003, literally a week or two after the U.S. invasion. Soldiers are wounded, they begin to show signs of infections, they are taking them back to the U.S. to be treated, and that bacteria moves all the way back with the bodies of these soldiers. But there's something very kind of, for us who live here, very annoying about this report. It's only worried about the U.S. soldiers' bodies. The Iraqi story, or why this is called Iraqi bacter, what's happening in Iraq around this bacteria is never really addressed in this presentation. So someone like me, I think as Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying, this needs a good biologist. Maybe actually we really need is a good anthropologist to think about this. So this is a kind of a slide showing the imipenem resistance to these of Acinetobacter over time. So you see that begins in 2013. There is a little bit of resistance, and as the years go by, this resistance becomes so high that it's almost 100%. So imipenem is like a third or fourth line of antibiotics that basically only used when it's really when all other antibiotics fail. But this bacteria was showing resistance to imipenem. And the other kind of part of the story is that in U.S. media, the story becomes very big. It becomes a big spectacle. All the news outlets, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Forbes magazine, Wired, all begin to write articles about this bacteria and how it's affecting the soldiers and how it's affecting people who in the U.S. who have never seen I've never seen combat before, because the bacteria, as these soldiers are moved to the U.S., it's moving within the hospital to other patients in these different places. But for me, what was the biggest kind of mystery here is what is Iraqi about Iraqibacter? You know, bacteria that carries such a name. The question was the mystery here is what is really Iraqi about it? So to answer this kind of mystery, or to address this mystery, I want to kind of try to introduce this idea of war biology. And war biology, I define it as the registration of war activities in human and non-human life. It's like, how can we actually see the impact of that war in both human life? So it could be affecting you as an illness, as a disease. You know, Dr. Shukri is here today. He spoke to us about how the impact of the war kind of is carried through the bodies of people living in areas with a lot of toxicities. But also the non-human life, because this is the effect on the environment, and also how can we see these war process being kind of observed or registered in something so small like bacteria. So to understand this, we need to understand the history of antibiotics. So antibiotics were not necessarily used in large population until the Second World War. The first time we begin, the world, or kind of the West, begins to use antibiotics was during the Second World War. And this is when antibiotics were given in mass and collectively to soldiers to protect them from war injuries. People get injured, and so when they get infections, antibiotics they were given these antibiotics so they can to save their lives. So, and this is one of these posters from the Second World War, and it says, you know, thanks to penicillin, he will come home. So that was like kind of a magic drug, a drug that changed the way we practice medicine. It was also a substance or a chemical that began to be produced industrially and given to animals, so that animals don't get sick. So in many ways, we increase the production of animals as a whole. So one of the kind of interesting things about this history is that over time, over the overuse of these antibiotics, the overproduction of antibiotics, the mass scale of this production has created a big problem, which is antimicrobial resistance. And antimicrobial resistance, here we can think about this idea as what we call a biology of history. When we think of history of biology, we think of who discovered what discovered the microscope, who saw the first bacteria. But if we think about this idea, the physical registration of human history in bacterial life, we attribute or understand that the resistance we see today of antibiotics is related to the activities of mass producing and mass using antibiotics in humans and animals. And in many ways, if we think about it, every time you or me or anyone here in this room takes one antibiotic, it's an environmental event. You know, there's a potential in that moment of resistance to emerge. When you take an antibiotic, there is a potentiality of this bacteria to develop resistance to that antibiotic. So in many ways, every time we use an antibiotic, it is an environmental event. I think keep that idea in mind. And if we look at the history of the antibiotics use and resistance, so if we look at kind of when a certain antibiotics gets introduced for mass consumption, and when the resistance to that antibiotics emerges, we see very close relationship. So every time we introduce an antibiotic, resistance comes out. So there is a very close connections. Whenever we start using these antibiotics, these resistance will begin to manifest in hospitals, or in animal production. So that's an important kind of biology of history. We see it here in the slides, showing that antibiotics today or the resistance that we see today is so much related to the timeline of introducing these antibiotics. And today, in 2015, the World Health Organization came out with a very important report showing that if we don't address antimicrobial resistance over the next decades, it will be the major killer in the world. We're going to be actually moving to an era that preceded the antibiotics. It's kind of the end of the antibiotic era. So the idea, if we don't address it now, by 2050, 10 million people every year will die from antimicrobial resistance. And the cost of that will be really like 66 trillion pounds a year from loss and problems due to this emerging infection problem. And when they put out this report, they created a kind of a classification of critical, high, and medium priority pathogens. And lo and behold, Acinetobacter baumannii seems to kind of sit on the top of the list of the critical priority. So there's a kind of a narrative about the need of addressing Acinetobacter as soon as possible because of its dangers in different healthcare settings. And so the policies around this has been mostly trying to improve awareness and understanding of antimicrobial resistance, strengthen the knowledge, reduce the incidence of infections, optimizing antimicrobial resistance, and develop economic cases for sustainability. However, in a lot of these reports that comes out from the WHO, there is no mention about the role of conflict and war in driving this problem of antimicrobial resistance. And so here, also the other kind of big problem that came out over the last couple of years is the COVID problem, because many healthcare settings across the world have normalized the use of antibiotics for COVID cases. There is no indication for using antibiotics for COVID. However, if you go to any protocol in like India, in Iraq, in many other countries, the antibiotics are given regularly to patients, even though they are not necessarily needed. So this has led to a 15% increase in antimicrobial resistant infections, and there's a 80%, almost 80% patients hospitalized with COVID who receive an antibiotic. This is like 80% of the patients who are hospitalized receive these antibiotics. So, we are obsessed with COVID, but there is a brewing, or kind of just that's the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of the problem that's going to come after is really going to be much bigger. And many cases that died in hospitals from COVID were not necessarily because of COVID, but actually they were related to infections, complications like antimicrobial resistance, blood infections happening from COVID, from antimicrobial resistance, COVID-related antibiotic use. So I moved to Beirut in 2011, and when I moved there, there was really an interesting phenomenon. This is kind of when I met also Mac at that time, and he was beginning to do his master's degree at the American University there. And one of the things that we noticed was the increase in the number of Iraqi patients coming to Beirut for treatment. And I think many of you probably know that a lot of Iraqis now try to find ways to outside Iraq to seek healthcare. And one of the things that I saw, that there were all these injured Iraqis from the civil war, from the bombings, from the conflicts in the region, that were traveling to seek healthcare for their wounds. So I started a project trying to look at these traveling wounds, what I call traveling wounds. And of course, the destruction of these cities in the Middle East has been, incredibly devastating, incredibly sad, and it's produced many injured bodies, people who've been injured for so many different reasons because of bullets, blast injuries, the collapse of lived environment. So, and of course from car bombs, suicide bombs, and this is a map of Baghdad showing the number of incidents where there had been fatal incidences from, let's say, a suicide bombing or a car bomb, or from a kind of a exchange of bullets and exchange of fighting. And so these, every single dot, there's at least one person who died during this incident, and this is between 2003 2014. So imagine if this one dot is one person dying in this incident, how many more dots exist there that people were injured? So we are maybe good with counting how many dead bodies we've lost from these wars, these body counts, but we are not very good with counting how many people were injured and what happens to these people over their lifetime. You know, how do these wounds survive these wars and what happens to them? So one of the things that I've been trying to do over the past decade is to think about what does it mean to study wounds as an anthropologist. You know, the idea of the wound is there is a kind of a physical element of the wound. We speak about, like, you know, I got wounded, I got injured. But then also there is another idea of the wound that people use in Iraq and other places in the world, or in the Middle East. The wound is also social. You know, sectarian violence is a form of a wound. People speak about Iraq in general as a wound. There's also, the wound is also very much attached to religious ritual, attached to religious practices. People remember the the grievances of their past and related to the present through kind of self-injury or self-wounding. So the wound is always present across these different registers, at the register of the body, at the register of the social body, and at the register of, like, symbolic meanings. So things that are what the wound as something that has a symbolic or an imaginary idea for conflict. So one of the things that I tried to do over the years is to follow what I call the biosocial life of wounds. So there is a social element. When someone gets injured, there are a lot of people around that person who are trying to give care. You know, maybe it is your son will help you to deal with the injury, or your father, or your brother. So there are social formations. People come together to try to address the wound, or to provide care, or to provide money. So the wound is a form of sociality. There are forms of sociality are kind of gets completely accentuated around the idea of woundedness. And the bio part is what I was seeing in places like the hospital, and I'll explain this a little bit more. So I worked at the American University of Beirut, and there was this fascinating increase of number of Iraqi patients coming to that hospital from 2003 until, let's say, 2011. And you can see around 2006, 2007, the number of the Iraqi patients begin to increase dramatically coming into Lebanon and coming into the hospital. And many of these cases were either cancer cases or were wound injury cases, and amongst other kind of problems. But what we began to see is this kind of influx of a lot of Iraqis coming into this place. So one of the things we did at that time is to kind of try to begin to understand this emerging, what we call, therapeutic geographies. The idea that, let's say, places of conflict, and with this wide range of displacement across the region, millions of people are being displaced from their homes, internally and externally. Many of these patients were now seeking care in different kinds of healthcare settings. So an Iraqi patient would go to Iran, and go to India, and go to Beirut, and go to Turkey. Someone from Syria will be receiving healthcare in Jordan or receiving healthcare in Beirut or coming maybe to Kurdistan for healthcare. So there is this kind of movement of different patients, different wounded patients across this interesting geography of the region. And one of the things that became very clear that the physicians and the healthcare professionals were seeing a new phenomenon. There was something very troubling about the cases that they were seeing. So they were saying, we see many tough cases from Iraq. This is a surgeon at the American University of Beirut. So he says there are these kind of advanced and aggressive cancer cases that we see. And then there are also, we're struggling with this high rates of multi-drug resistant bacteria. And whenever we see, for a while, they were actually putting Iraqis in quarantine before admitting them to the hospital to make sure that they don't carry these multi-drug resistant bacteria. So we began a lot of activities around this idea of woundedness, about injuries, and we developed this program at the American University of Beirut called the Conflict Medicine Program. And the idea was to document how medicine and society are kind of being transformed around questions of conflict and war. And we began documenting many problems. This is my colleague, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's a war surgeon. He's a reconstructive surgeon. He does reconstructions of war injuries. And so we established this conflict medicine program and at the American University, and we did this, which was part of this emerging Institute of Global Health. Usually, when we talk about global health, it's usually a center present in Europe or in the US. This was one of the first global health institutes based in the global south or in the region. And what we were trying to do, we were kind of addressing social science problems, medical problems, and policy problems. So we were trying to create a kind of evidence-based resources for war injuries. We're trying to train health professionals, trying to kind of implement innovative solutions, establish guidelines, translate research experiences into expertise or into policy. So this was like, part of the work that we were doing at the time. And during this work, we kind of came up with a number of hypotheses. And these are 3 hypotheses that I'm going to go through with you and explain what's their context and things that I've been working on in my research. Some of them can be proved or some of them cannot be proved, but it's also just how to think about this idea of war biology or the biology of history through the conflict and through the specific bacteria. So I worked as a doctor in Iraq in the 1990s. And one of the things that happened in Iraq during that time is that the U.S. Bombardment of Iraq's infrastructure was so pervasive. Electricity was kind of almost destroyed. Like we had only 4% left of electricity across the country. I mean, there was efforts to kind of improve that afterwards, but it never really reached anywhere close to the pre-war levels. But what was happening, electricity was so central to everything that we had in hospital care, in sanitation, in cleaning, water chlorination, and sewage treatment. And so what happens in this decade of sanctions, all of these sanitation and problems begins to, all the sanitation kind of processes collapse, and then infection control also collapses, and we see this kind of rise of infections across the hospital. And as doctors, one thing we begin to do as practitioners, especially when in the surgical ward, is to begin to over-prescribe antibiotics. We try to do broad spectrum antibiotics to all the patients coming into the ward, even if if you read a textbook on an appendectomy, removing your appendix, you don't necessarily need an antibiotic unless there's a major infection. But we will give any patients coming in triple antibiotics. to cover all the possible infections. Also, we were reusing disposable gloves. We were reusing stitches because we had big shortages of those, medical supplies. So in general, the hospital becomes increasingly a septic place, a toxic place, where infection is rampant, and to deal with that, we were trying to save the patients by over-prescribing antibiotics to all these different patients. So this is kind of the first idea that what we were seeing in post-2003, what the Americans begin to report is as a result of this history of the sanctions and how the sanctions had changed antibiotic prescriptions and wound care throughout the 1990s. So this is one hypothesis. The second, and the thing with this hypothesis is that when you introduce something like a prescription culture in Iraq, this culture continues. It doesn't go away with the kind of the end of the sanctions. So until now, if you go and do a study on public hospitals and public or even private hospitals in Iraq, you'll see the use of antibiotics is so prevalent. The overuse of antibiotics is so prevalent everywhere, and this is something that's become a big problem across all these different hospital settings in Iraq. The second hypothesis, which we didn't kind of expect, was the idea that heavy metal contamination, environmental contaminations in these war settings, and it's like a car bomb or an explosion, has sedimentation of these heavy metals in that environment of the bomb. And these heavy metals were also entering the wounds of those who get injured. And one thing that we realized from the literature, there was no literature on war and heavy metals, but there was literature on the role of heavy metals in industrial and agricultural sites, and how that bacteria develops resistance to heavy metals. So when there is the bacteria that is present in the environment, like Acinetobacter, it's actually a benign bacteria. It's present on our skin. It's present in soil, it's present in water, but it's an opportunistic infection. Whenever it sees an opportunity, it enters the body. So we realized that heavy metals, there's a hypothesis that says that heavy metals was driving antimicrobial resistance. So how does that happen? This is a process called cross-resistance. So when a heavy metal exists in the environment of this bacteria, it develops resistance to it. But that same mechanism, so let's say this is call it an efflux pump. The bacteria begins to pump out metals to get rid of it. So it's a kind of a way to get rid of these toxins. It's the same mechanism that begins to pump out antibiotics. So the bacteria develops resistance to heavy metals. That same resistance is also a resistance to antibiotics. This is what's called cross-resistance. The third hypothesis is what I'm calling antibiotic anarchy. And of course, you see this in this kind of post-war settings when there is no regulation, there is no rules, and also there is a lot of corruption across different sectors of society. Sounds familiar. And this is an image I took from my visit to Mosul last week. And one thing that I kind of realized there is this blooming of all these private sector buildings, like mainly pharmacists buy a building. A pharmacist will buy a building and then will rent out these different clinics to the doctors. You're laughing, you know what I'm talking about, maybe. And what happens here is that patients, how do these doctors pay the rent? It's the patient who pays the rent. So the patients go to the doctor. The doctor overprescribe. They give them a long list of medications, including antibiotics, regardless they need it or not. Sometimes they give them the same antibiotics from different companies. This is all so that the pharmacist will actually benefit from this process. Now, who's benefiting from this? I was talking to Adnan today about this. This is how it's been happening across Iraq and Baghdad and Basra and Najaf. So what is going on here is that we are overusing these medications for the sake of commercial and financial benefits and rewards. And the patients are paying the price for that. So what we see now is like that within public hospitals, you see this overuse of antibiotic that has a long history from the 1990s. We see contamination of the environment that is also impacting the bacteria, and we see a kind of a very commercial form of medicine where patients are tricked to and have overprescriptions of medications, including antibiotics. So all of this ecology, this kind of real ecology that we see, has to do a lot with, I think, one of the that made Iraq over the past years having this really high rates of antimicrobial resistance. So to conclude, what can we expect with this war biology, what we can call like the afterlives of war? So one thing, as I said, war actions are registered in human and non-human life. We saw that war leaves it wounds the body, it wounds the environment, and it produces processes of evolution at a very microscopic level for the bacteria. Biology is situated. That means that what we see in a place like Iraq in terms of these bacteria, or how patients are experiencing higher rates of cancer or high rates of antimicrobial resistance, that means that biology is different in relationship to place as well as relationship to time. The bacteria that we had 50 years ago is very different than the bacteria we have today. So we need historians and we need anthropologists to understand that kind of situatedness of biology. The other thing that we can see is, for those who are studying biotechnology, we are moving more and more to be able to sequence the genetics of this bacteria. And with phylogenetic analysis, we can actually plot bacteria kind of evolution over time. So can we imagine, if we can think of this bacteria as an archive of the war, if we can actually see some of these evolutionary events, these environmental events happening in relationship to political events, So this is an important kind of idea where we can kind of think about the history of that war being kind of registered in the genes and the genes of this bacteria. So, this is an interesting provocation. So for me, the war biology is not necessarily a thing that we can define that easily, but it could also be, as we said, it's a kind of this registration, but it's also a set of problems, questions, and phenomena which I try to explore war and militarism and their consequences on our collective bodies and the environment. So, it's a kind of it's not necessarily one thing, but it's a set of problems that begin to emerge. It could be cancer. We can think about cancer as the rising cancer as a form of war biology. We can think about congenital anomalies as a form of war biology. We can think about many of these problems under this umbrella of what we can call war biology. And most interestingly for us, and this is what we're trying today to do in this symposium, is to think about an agenda for research, ways of collaboration, ways of doing interdisciplinary work. We can bring historians, anthropologists, biotechnology experts, microbiologists, epidemiologists, physicians, all can come together and think about these different levels and registers of this war biology. Thank you very much.
Now we have a discussion for about 15 minutes. Please say your name. You don't have to say your name if you don't want to, but try and keep it to one question of each so that multiple people can have their questions heard. So any questions, Dr. Omar?
My name is Bella Ilan, a student at. I just quite understand. Why didn't I?
Okay.
Bacteria now, someone gets it up. Doesn't antibiotics. But
Yes.
why?
Right. Excellent. Yeah, I don't think I kind of went into the details of it because of the short. So when the bacteria the multi-drug resistance usually is defined could come in two places. One could be hospital-based. So you have a patient in the hospital, you give them antibiotics, and then within the hospital, this new bacteria, this multi-drug resistant bacteria could emerge. Okay, so overuse of antibiotics, you see antibiotic resistance emerge in ICU where patients are sick, they are vulnerable, their immunity is compromised, and this is the kind of the perfect place for antibiotic resistance to emerge. So it's inside the hospital and related to antibiotics. But there's other form of resistance that is happening in the environment. So if you sample a sewage system in a place like Mosul, for example, or in Basra, you will find these XDRs or multi-drug resistant bacteria in the sewage. Now, where is this bacteria coming from? This bacteria could be, impacted by antibiotic use and comes with, extract of human extracts or what, excretions and all of that stuff. But there are studies now showing that in industrial settings and agricultural settings, that bacteria is becoming resistant in the environment because of the environmental because of the heavy metal leakages into the environment. So you have a factory, let's say, gets bombed, or a factory that has a problem that there's a lot of leakages of the heavy metal material into the environment. That environment, if you sample from it, you'll see high levels of heavy metals with high levels of multi-drug resistant bacteria. So there is a connection between this bacteria developing multi-drug resistance that is not necessarily related to antibiotic use, but it is actually because of heavy metal contaminations. And you can see this also happening in agricultural settings, where what do you call the samad, the fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers, they have a lot of heavy metals in them. So that these leakages of these chemicals in the environment are also being associated with high levels of antimicrobial resistance of this bacteria. And this is the cross-resistance story. So for the context of, let's say, war, the question is, when these bombs are exploding in these places, a lot of this heavy metal are entering into the wounds of people. And the wound becomes then this kind of petri dish, where if there is this bacteria on your skin, then it tries to develop resistance to the heavy metal. And by the time, let's say, the patient gets into the hospital, this bacteria has already kind of developed antibiotic resistance. I mean, a lot of this stuff is we cannot see them. We cannot really say, oh, this is happening, this is the sequence of the process. Biology is very difficult to capture. What we see are snapshots. It's phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that we see, and then we try to link these phenomena together. So this is why it's very difficult to create causality. But it is important to show these different snapshots. And that's what I tried to do. There's different snapshots because we cannot necessarily capture a very clearly biological process. What we prove in the lab is something completely different what happens in reality. There's so many different factors that affect it. So we don't know, but it is a hypothesis. We can hypothesize, we can think of that, we can propose that there is a pathway for resistance that involves heavy metals contamination in the environment. Does that make sense?
Any other questions? Have Iraq
Yes, yes. So one of the other places that we have seen this bacteria flourishing is, of course, the problem is with Iraqi hospitals that no one is documenting these problems. So even when you see infections, no one is doing culture and sensitivity testing, antibiotic culture and sensitivity. People just think about the usual bacteria, the usual Pseudomonas, Staph aureus, whatever. Very few people are looking for this bacteria. However, the organization that began to report it in the region was Doctors Without Borders, MSF. So if you look at the hospital, Amman hospital of MSF, where a lot of Iraqis were being shipped and transferred there for treatment, you see that that hospital has been experiencing high levels of multi-drug resistance bacteria. At the American University of Beirut, when I worked, half of the injured Iraqis had multi-drug resistance bacteria, and half of the multi-drug resistant bacteria was Acinetobacter baumannii, this Iraqi bacter infection. So yes, we are seeing that, but because we don't have a systematic reporting like the U.S. military, every single soldier is being kind of monitored across all the pathway of injury and then going back to the U.S. We don't have that reporting. So the reporting has not been very clear, has not been very systematic. So this is what we've been lacking, a system that kind of traces, a surveillance system that traces every time there is a multi-drug resistance that needs to be reported. It's just only last couple of years that the Ministry of Health began to pay attention to this problem. And think about also, and the other problem with this, with let's say a lot of the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Yemenis or the Libyans who are injured, who are developing this, is that they're also moving across the region. And as they're moving, that local biology, that biology of these wounds is moving with them. So these bacteria are also moving. There's the story of the American soldiers, but then there's the story of all these people who are crossing borders, moving from one place to the other, and carrying with them a lot of these infections. In Germany, when a lot of the displaced Syrians arrived in Germany, there were a lot of reports of also Acinetobacter baumannii and other kind of multi-drug resistant bacteria that were present on the bodies and the wounds of some of these refugees. So it seems that a lot of this bacteria seems to really have this affinity to these kind of war settings, and it's moving as people are being displaced across this kind of wide geography from here to Europe to the United States.
Another question. Philip.
Hi, I have more technical question, and it's be like where like which method?
Well, we
Take a couple of questions. Yeah.
what could the average person do to prevent melting over prescribing antibiotics?
Yeah. This is excellent. Yes. Yeah.
I have not take
And
answer question. how about the and but what about treatment medicine?
Excellent. I think kind of they're all related in many ways. So methodology, like for us in anthropology, one of the things we do, so we're not necessarily doing the science. We're not really trying to find and isolate the bacteria, figure out the sequencing. It's not necessarily my job. But as an anthropologist, we call it early signal detection. We begin to see this problem emerging amongst people very early on, before the epidemiologists would come in. Before this becomes an epidemic, we begin to see it in sporadic cases happening. And then we're asking this question, what is going on? So what I did in the conflict medicine program, we began a big research project. And we applied for like these really big grants, 10 million euros, 6 million pounds, things like that. And we had this big team of epidemiologists, environmental scientists, microbiologists, with partnerships with Doctors Without Borders, with ICRC. These are all entities that work around this problem. And what we developed a plan to think about how do you create this correlation? How do you make this correlation to stick, or to at least show some evidence around it? And one of the ideas, so we had different arms of this project. One arm had to do with the hospital. So you do anthropology, do epidemiology, you follow the injured patients as they enter until they kind of, let's say, get released, or maybe they die, and try to figure out when do they develop this resistance, and if this resistance they came with it or they developed it inside the hospital. So this was like one arm of the study, is to look at the kind of the social history and epidemiology within the hospital. The second arm of the project was going into the environment and was trying to sample environmental sites and to see if within the environment if there are multi-drug resistant bacteria, and what are usually the levels of heavy metals in that setting. So you create, and of course we're sampling. We know this is all bacteria is being kind of captured from the hospital, and bacteria is being captured from the environment, all being sent to the microbiologist. The microbiologist is sequencing and trying to see if this bacteria we see in the environment is similar to the ones we are seeing in the wounds. Because if the same, then that means that the multi-drug resistance has kind of developed in the environment rather than necessarily in the hospital. But if we see something different, then we know that it is more hospital-based and antibiotic-based. So, and then the third level of another level of the microbiology labs was doing experimental biology. So they were bombarding bacteria with heavy metals, and then seeing what kind of in a more like a lab, you get like this kind of pure form of this bacteria that is not called wild form, and you bombard it with heavy metals, and you see what kind of resistance they develop, and then you kind of try to match it with more real life things that you've gathered from these different conflict settings. And then we have the sociologists, the anthropologists, the historians trying to make sense of all of this data and trying to plot it over a kind of history of political events. So that was like kind of the big project. We never kind of followed through with this project, didn't kind of go all the way, mainly because of, COVID. Because when COVID happened, all of this kind of research stopped. But some of my colleagues right now have been gathering a lot of archives, bacterial archives from all conflict settings. And they've been just slowly sequencing and trying to kind of create a huge map of these conflict multi-drug resistant bacteria and see if there's any correlation between them. Are we seeing different species? Are these species the same? So that process is still ongoing. The heavy metal one is still the most difficult to do because, it's not that easy right now because it's not necessarily always there are bombings and send people to the field to do the sampling. But let's say the third one, the antibiotic anarchy, is a project that I'm trying now to develop in a place like Mosul, for example. So I can kind of go and try to understand how these prescriptions are happening, what kind of antibiotics are coming into the country. And of course, at the end of the day, then the idea what could come out of this is pushing policy. Antibiotics should not be sold, over the counter. This has stopped a long time ago in many countries in the world. But here it's like antibiotics are given like, charazat, people take it like this. Anyone, like, if you don't give them antibiotics, the patient will be pissed off at you. So I think there needs to be regulation of antibiotic use, and doctors, we should start with doctors and the pharmacists, and I think there needs to be control over how prescription, all this corruption in prescription practices needs to be addressed. And I guess the third element is environmental cleanup, because that's the biggest problem. A lot of times these places get bombed, these places get destroyed, but there is no really clear process of cleanup. And this is, let's say, in a place like Basra, there has been decades of wars in Basra, but there's never been, like, no government that came to power cleaned up anything. So it's an accumulation of layer and after layer and after layer of these wastes, and that's kind of really, really sad. What was the third question? Yes. So as I said, the AMR is a global problem. Everywhere in the world it's happening, but it's happening in a much faster rate in this part of the world. We see it also happening in South Asia and India, not necessarily because of conflict, but because of this overprescription and commercial kind of use of antibiotics. So the world is trying to address this through different ways. First, through controlling prescription of antibiotics, maybe decrease the use of antibiotics. One of the doctors today was telling me that even if there is antibiotic-resistant bacteria, they are now trying to not use antibiotics. So they clean up the wound daily, they keep on cleaning it locally. You use local methods of cleaning wounds rather than having a systematic pill that you swallow and then you expect that pill will be healing you, because as we said, every time you take a pill, it's an environmental event. You have to think about it that way. So local wound debridement, local wound healing. There are people who are using different things like honey to do this. There are local nails used in the fractures. They're called cement nails. That the nail it's covered with antibiotics, specific antibiotics for the bacteria. It's a nail that you develop for the bacteria itself, and then you use it. But these are very personalized treatments. Not everyone can do that. The other line of defense against bacteria is now the more advanced ones now. It's called phages. I don't know, anyone knows what a phage is? Viral phages? So bacteriophage, which are basically viruses that are specifically cultivated to attack multi-drug resistant bacteria. So we used to have a chemical warfare on bacteria with antibiotics. Now we are developing biological war against the bacteria. So that's another alternative. The problem with the phage is that you cannot use it like antibiotic, like, just give a phage to anyone who has an infection, because you have to design the phage specifically to the bacteria. So it's a very personalized problem. It's very expensive, not everywhere in the world, but it is one of the potential ways of addressing this problem. So yeah, it's a going to be a major problem.
We'll probably have time for one more question.
It's kind of. Can you elaborate a little bit more? What do you mean what do you mean the immune system here?
Like the overthinking.
Uh-huh.
They have decreased the efficiency. Why not? What's
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does, but I guess with bacteria, I guess it does. Becomes a crutch, the drug becomes like a crutch. Probably it does. I think many people kind of think about now of immunity. The question is, what is immunity? Is immunity kind of generalized or local? So sometimes they say when you go to a new place, you drink from the water, even if it's contaminated, but because you'll develop a certain kind of immunity to things, or you eat the local yogurt or local honey, because like honey, the bees produce a certain kind of substances that are very much local, that they address the kind of the local bugs. I think the question here is, how do we think of immunity as a situated problem? How do we develop also tools to boost it also on the local level? But yes, drugs in general, they're systematic. They work on obstructing a certain kind of process in the body, but they don't necessarily allow the body to develop, but some drugs do. So I think it depends on what drugs we're talking about, I guess. Some drugs help you to develop your own immunity. Some drugs maybe suppress your immunity in favor of dealing with cortisone, for example, corticosteroids. Like they suppress your immunity because they attack. It's a systematic way to suppress inflammation. But inflammation is usually the way we react to kind of, let's say, an infection or an injury or a wound or something like that. So yeah, I guess it depends on the case. Yeah.
I think one thing that's important for those of you who are, let's say, in international studies or in social science, aren't the kind of medical lab science, so many of the questions that Dr. Anwar raised today, really you cannot answer without some kind of social science, some kind of behavioral science. You ask a simple question. Why is it? How do we stop doctors from overprescribing? You're already asking a behavioral and social question, right? It's related not only to, there's so many things. The way that the professionalization of doctors, pathways of pedagogy, political economy of pharmaceuticals, how they come in a broad border. There's markets and creates pressures and incentives on doctors to prescribe things in a certain way. So these are questions that I hope that those of you that are in the social sciences won't think, oh, that's a medical thing. I can't address that. I have no role of thinking about these questions. Even if you're thinking about issues like conflict drivers, right? You're saying, what are the sources of instability in particular areas of Iraq, in Nineveh, in Salahuddin, whatever. You have to think about what are the circuits that feed conflict. So pharmaceutical smuggling is a huge business for a lot of these armed groups in Iraq. It's a part of what feeds into their sort of the capacity to fund themselves. Capacity. So a lot of these questions that you might think are just medical questions that you think are just sort of outside of your scope of interest really should be integrated into your thinking a lot of times. And I hope as we consider, a lot of times at IRIS, we've been more of a policy institute that focuses, I guess, on policy questions that you're just more typical than humanitarian settings. We're gradually moving more into some of these health issues, so I hope that a lot of you students will gain with us and we'll start to think about the connections between policies in humanitarian space and public services space that overlap with health. But with that, thank you so much, Omar.
Thank you. Thank you.